Okay, everybody. Uh, Time for us to start a new seif. So let's go to our new packet. And the Rav Shulchan Aruch states as follows. We're up to Sif Hey in Dinei Nizkei Mamon, the laws of damages, of financial damage. Im Mamon Chaveru Mazik Es Shalo. So let's say that the following scenario. Your friend's property is damaging your property. And we'll see that this has to do with the example that's provided in the Gemara is, your animal, your dog or your cow or your ox is damaging my property. And the only way that I can protect my objects, my property, is by damaging your property. Mutter ve'ein tzarach lios nizok mechavero v'leiredi molidin. So that is permitted according to halacha. You're not obligated to wait for your property to be utterly destroyed and then take him to Beis Din. But if you see that his property is destroying your property, you're allowed to destroy his property or in some way damage it in order to prevent his property from damaging your property. Okay. And let's say, for example, I know I have a neighbor who I'm very good friends with. Let's say he has a tree that is, its roots are moving into my property and destroying my property. So I tell him, listen, you got to cut the roots. Otherwise, he says, well, if I cut the roots, it'll kill the tree. So that's too bad. But if your roots are coming into my property and creating havoc, you're going to have to do it, or I will in some way destroy the property. But what I am obligated to do is to minimize the damage to the best of my ability. And if there's any way for me to preserve my property without destroying my neighbor's property, just that it'll take a little bit more effort, then I would be obligated to do that in order to fulfill my heavenly duty. Even though if I did damage his property, I would be patur. Because by damaging your property, I'm not just wantonly damaging your property. I'm doing it in order to save my own property. So even though I may have done it, I can't face repercussions in a Beis Din. But Hashem will hold me responsible if I could have saved my property without damaging your property, but it just would have taken a little bit more effort. So perhaps the argument would be, if the roots are growing into my property, perhaps we could have figured out a way to divert the roots, or I don't know, I'm not sure if there's such a way to do that, or to figure out a way to dig up the roots and to put them somewhere else. I'm not sure. Kizu mitzvahs aseh litroach begufo lahatzil mamon chavero mehefsed. He says, because this is a positive commandment in the Torah, to exert effort to help your friend and to help your friends preserve your friend's property. There is a mitzvah in the Torah to put yourself out in order to help save someone else's property. What does that fall? What rubric does that fall under? Uvichlal hashavas avedahi, k'moshen yisbar behilchos mitzia. It's part of the mitzvah of hashavas aveda, of returning property to your fellow. If he loses property, you have a mitzvah to return it, even though it may take some level of exertion. It will take time from your day and so forth. As we've already explained in the laws of Mitzia, the laws of finding lost objects. So therefore, this is no different. It may require me to exert a certain amount of effort to prevent your property from damaging mine, right? Even though halachically, I could get away with it by saying, without exerting effort, I can damage your property, and that'll put an end to the problem. And if I do that, I will not be held accountable by a mortal court. But Hashem's attitude will be that you had to go above and beyond the letter of the law because there's the mitzvah of Hashavas Aved. Ulefichach. And so based on everything that we've written, Shor Chavero Sha'ala al Gabe Shor Lahorgo, that if my friend's ox jumps on top of my ox with malicious intent, in other words, these two oxen get into a fight, okay? And so we're dealing with farm animals, and your ox jumps on my ox in order to inflict harm upon it. Lo yidchafenu me alav. So I should not just push your ox off of my ox, because by pushing it with force, it may end up injuring or killing your ox. Im efshalo lishmod eshalom mitachtav. If there's another way where I can just pull my ox away without harming the other ox, I'm obligated to do that. It may take a little bit more effort to pull my ox from under your ox, but I'm obligated to do that instead of just inflicting harm upon your ox. V'gam kesheshomto yishmatenu benachas v'lo bekoach sheyipol ha'elyon. And when I do pull my ox away, I should do it gently and gradually, without making efforts to avoid causing your ox to fall abruptly on the ground, which might end up breaking its leg or doing some other kind of damage to your ox. V'chein kol kayotze bazeh, and this is true in all other similar cases. So first we'll see the Imrei Yaakov. Let's see. Belered imo ladin. He says that you're not obligated to wait until your friend's property damages yours and then have to take him to Beis Din afterwards. Ve'ein hanazikin mishtalmin ela b'ri'iyah berura uve'edim kisherim. And he says, and if your friend's property does end up damaging your property, you can only collect if there was clear testimony and kosher witnesses. Ve'ein makablim ha'edus ela bifnei ba'al din, afilu hayahu ve'edav cholim. And we can only accept, he's just really incidentally just verifying that when you do take someone to Beis Din, you have to make sure that it is, you set up your case properly. You have to bring witnesses, and the litigants have to be present in the Beis Din, even if someone is ill. You have to make sure that they all appear before the Beis Din. What's interesting is, what would be the halacha in a world of Zoom? Do all of the litigants have to be physically present in front of the Beis Din? Well, it would stand to reason that if the secular courts are allowing Zoom to hold the legal hearing, probably the Beis Din would allow it as well. But normally everyone has to be present in the courtroom. Now, before we do the next Imrei Yaakov, where he's going to deal with Nizkei Behema in general, I wanted to see this piece in the Biurim first, because I think it's he sort of clarifies what the Rav Shulchan Aruch is trying to communicate here. So let's take a look at the Biurim first. He says, "Mashmaus hadvarim dezed dugma lamashi hikdim lomar." He says it seems from the way that this halacha has been written, is that the example that is provided in the second half of the Sif helps to illustrate and inform what was said in the first part of the Sif. And so therefore, he had said in the first part of the Sif that if there's any way for you to protect your property without damaging your neighbor's property, you have an obligation to do so, even if you could exonerate yourself by damaging your fellow's property in a mortal Beis Din. And then he gives the illustration of pulling your ox away gently from under the attacking ox instead of harming the attacking ox. And he says it sounds like that's an illustration of what he just mentioned above. That if you can save your property without damaging your fellow's property, you have an obligation to do that. He says, but there's something wrong with this analogy. He says, the specific example really is not similar to the general rule. He says, because this whole illustration, this example that he gave, that you have an obligation to pull your own ox out gently whenever possible, the Shulchan Aruch says that if you weren't careful and you didn't pull out your animal gently in the prescribed method, then the person who owns the ox which is being attacked can be held financially liable for damaging the attacking ox if you didn't pull out your ox gently. And the Rav Shulchan Aruch had just said that that you can't be held legally responsible in a mortal court in a Beis Din. He says, "V'im kain eino doma lahareisha." He says, therefore, the example is really dissimilar to what he was speaking about initially. He says, because previously the Rav Shulchan Aruch had been saying that you're not required by the letter of the law to exert this this effort in order to save your friend's property. It's just that there's a heavenly obligation because of the positive commandment of Hashavas Aveda. Uvidi avad eno chayav l'shalem. And therefore the implication is that if I failed to exert myself to save my friend's property, then I'm not going to be liable. So which one is it? Am I liable or am I not liable? If I don't exert proper effort and precautions to preserve my friend's property. That's his question. So he offers the following solution. He says, "Ach efshar liyashev divrei harav al pi ma shekasvu hatosfos b'kama chav ches amud aleph divrei hamaschil mishaber v'zel lashon." We might be able to answer the question based on something that Tosfos writes, where he talks about breaking your friend's utensils in order to save your own. That Tosfos writes, "Aflagav deleel amrinan shahayalo l'shamto." He says, Tosfos says that you had an obligation to pull your animal out from under the attacking animal. Hainu mishum deleka tircha bashmita yoter mibad dechifa. He says that is referring to a case where there's no greater effort involved in pulling your animal out gently from underneath than there is in pushing the attacking ox. He says in that situation, then you're clearly obligated to save your property without damaging your friend's property, because there's no additional effort that is required by doing it in such a way where your friend's property will not be damaged. Because aval hacha lo atrachuhu l'sadron ze al ze. But over here, the rabbis did not require you to go to the effort to help organize your friend's utensils. Meaning what? Mishum hachi amrinin dahamamali chatzar chaber kadayayin v'chadei shemen bala chatzar mishaber v'yotze mishaber v'nichnas. He says the illustration that the Gemara is talking about over there is talking about where my friend takes a whole bunch of his earthenware pottery and he fills my entire yard with it without asking me permission. In other words, he's manufacturing pottery and he fills up his whole space with pottery, and he decides without asking me to go ahead and he goes ahead and fills up my entire lot with pottery as well. And so the halacha of the Gemara is that I'm not obligated to start going to the effort of stacking my friend's pottery to move it out of the way. If I got to get my tractor out of the barn and the whole pathway to the barn is filled with pottery, I can just drive my tractor over the pottery and destroy whatever pottery he's placed in its path. So Tosfos says, how is that any different from the fact that I'm obligated to gently pull out my ox instead of damaging his ox? Why shouldn't there be an obligation for me to go and pick up all of the pottery that's blocking the path of my tractor and move it out of the way? So Tosfos says the difference is that there's a significant exertion required. It'll take me a few minutes, maybe even, a couple of hours if it's a really long path, to clear out all of my friend's pottery from where my tractor needs to go. And there, the halacha the letter of the law does not require you to go to great efforts to protect your friend's property. It's only lifnim mishur sadin, above the letter of the law, that I should do that. So that's the differentiation between the first halacha and the second halacha. And therefore, based on that Tosfos, he says, "V'im kein lefi divrei Tosfos davka im leka tircha b'shmita as chayev im dachaf." So therefore, only if there's no added exertion required for me to extricate my bull or my ox by gently pulling him out, am I obligated to do so? And if I fail to do so and I instead damage my friend's ox, then I have an obligation to compensate for it, because I could have just as easily saved my own property without damaging his. But if there's significantly more effort involved in saving his property, instead of just riding roughshod all over it, so then the letter of the law holds me exempt, but the mitzvah of hashavas aveda requires me to exert efforts to preserve my friend's property. And that seems to be what the Rav Shulchan Aruch means over here. The gamhecha diika tircha, that even when there's exertion involved or required by Shemitah to pull out my ox from underneath, mikol makom yesh lo litroach, I still have a heavenly obligation, at least, to put in the extra efforts to save my ox without damaging the other ox. Ach im lo tarach az ein lechayvo medina. He says, but if I don't exert that added effort, then I cannot be litigated in Beis Din, because of the fact that I could always claim I wasn't interested in that extra effort. I didn't want to risk the damage to my ox, and I wasn't interested in giving myself a hernia or whatever my claim might be in Beis Din. Then I can exempt myself. Ulam lo matzasi beposkim shetiku ledinas divrei hatosfos anal v'shulchan aruch sham sasam b'chayev b'chol gavni b'tzarachim. He says the only problem that I have is that what I've just suggested is not something that is discussed by prior poskim. So he basically says he's a little bit hesitant to say that that's definitively the explanation, but it seems pretty clear that he's on the right track. I'm just going to skip a little bit further down where he provides us a very practical example of this halach. He says, "V'hinei midin hanal shel mishaber v'yotzeu mishaber v'nichnas." But based on what we've just learned, that if my friend goes ahead and puts a whole bunch of pottery in the middle of my area which I need to traverse, and it's an added tircha for me to move his stuff, I'm permitted technically to just ride roughshod all over them and to break them. He says, "Yesh lifshot nidon shel rechev shebe'alav he'emiduha b'makom ma'avar al hakvish." Let's think about a contemporary example. A guy has parked his car in such a way where it prevents my car from getting out of the driveway. Okay? So he's been quite inconsiderate. So his car being obnoxiously parked and blocking my ability to get out of my driveway is preventing me from going to work, right? And I can't get a hold of the guy. I don't even know who the guy is. So Uvishulchan Aruch Simin Taf Yud Beis Sif Beis Pasak HaMechaber the Imile Kol Haderech Kadim Potter Al Shvirasan, that if my friend goes ahead and fills the whole pathway, which I need to traverse to get from point A to point B, he fills it with pottery, and I go ahead and I uh, trample on that pottery and break it, I cannot be held legally responsible, because who told you, who gave you the right to put your stuff there, and who gave you the right to block my passage? The imile kol aderech kadem sheyefshar la'avor, afilu shibro biyadayim patur, and I will be exempt even if I actively destroy the pottery by, let's say, riding my tractor over it, in the example that I gave. Ubir hasma sham sifkat and gimel, and the sma in his commentary to the Shulchan Aruch basically says, Dimhaya efshalo l'savei v'leilech min hatzad, o la'agbir raglav la'avor derech alehem, bishum hachi davka b'nitkal ba v'shibro ka'amar de patur. He says that if it was possible for me to circumvent the pottery and to walk around it, even though it would take me a little bit longer, or to, if I would have lifted up my legs a little bit more carefully and tiptoed a little bit around the pottery or over the pottery, I might have been able to avoid damaging it. But I'm still going to be potter if I walk through it and end up damaging it instead. Aval kishenile kol kach ad she'i efshar la'avor, so he says, in a situation where it was possible for me to circumvent, but I didn't, I wasn't as adept in my efforts, and I ended up accidentally breaking them, then I'll be potter. But if the guy flagrantly filled up the entire pathway, so that even if I really, really try hard, I still won't be able to avoid stepping on the pottery. So then I'm potter, even if I go ahead knowingly and step on his pottery, then I'm going to be potter. So the question then becomes, what about a situation like this? So lefize, nafkalon ladina di'im harechev sotemet ha'ma'avar she'i efshar la'avor. So if my friend's car is blocking the path, of my driveway, so that's mamish impossible for me to get out of my driveway. Okay, so v'gami efshar l'sovev leilech min hatzad, and there's no way of circumventing and going around. Let's say I might have to ride on my lawn and just very, very slowly drive over the curb. That might be one solution. Okay, even if I can't get out of my driveway. But if that's also not possible, because he's literally blocked the only way for me to get out. So then in that kind of situation, the Rashai Rechev Acher Haba Lifkoa Bo Ulasalko Hatzida. He says then it would be permissible in that situation for my car to push his car as I'm pulling out, even though I know that in the course of pushing his car, he's going to sustain damage. And that's permitted technically, right? In other words, I cannot be litigated against, I cannot be sued in a beis din according to the halacha. Gam im barur shahadavar yigrom lo nezek, even if it's clear that some damage will ensue to my friend's car by my pushing it with my car. Ulam im efshar la'asod b'li lahaziko yesh lihishtadel kamo shekasav kan harav. But if it's possible move his car without damaging him, so then I have to do whatever effort I can to avoid it. And this is where we get into the heavenly obligation, that even though I can exempt myself by saying it's going to take me an extra hour or two by calling the tow company or by waiting for him to come back or whatever it is, I'm obligated to make that extra effort to save my friend's property, mishum delogara me hashavas aveda, because it's no different from the mitzvah of hashavas aveda. So if he's blocking my access to get my car to where I need it to go, technically, if there's no other remedy other than moving his car, and in the course of moving it, I'm damaging it, which usually will happen to a car that's in park if you're going to try to move it. So then I cannot be held liable. But if there's a way for me to exert a little bit more effort or to wait a little bit more time, then from a heavenly standpoint, I'm obligated to. Obviously, I'm not obligated to go to such superhuman efforts that I could lose my job, or I'll lose a hugely important meeting or something like that. So then I can exempt myself. But that would be a contemporary example of how you can save your own loss by damaging your friend's property when it's absolutely necessary and there's no other recourse available. Okay.
If I can ask a question here.
Yeah.
We're talking about effort needing to expend. How about money needing to expend? It'll cost you a lot more to do it in a different way that's less harmful. Are you required to expend funds in order to avoid damage, and can that be recouped?
Right. So let's that's a good question. So let's think about it. If the mitzvah is because of Hashavas Aveda, what did we learn when we learned the halachas of Hashavas Aveda as far as expending money? Let's say it's going to cost me more money to go to the effort of returning this person's lost object. I found my friend's Great Dane. And in order for me to return my friend's Great Dane, I have to bring it in my house. I have to feed it. I have to, there's a lot of effort that's involved in when you find a big dog, how to keep it so that the owner will be able to retrieve it.
I thought we said that you can charge for that.
You are allowed to charge for it. I can send him an invoice afterwards. I still have a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda. But I'm allowed to charge him for the effort that it took in order to preserve his property. So the same would probably be true over here. Let's say I call a tow company, and the company tows his car away. They bring it to their lot, and as we know, it costs a fortune to get your car out of what is it? I don't even know. Has anyone ever had their car towed? What does it cost these days? People tell me it costs a lot of money.
Yeah, and there's an impounding fee and all those things, probably. Yeah.
Right. And he's incensed. He's incensed because he says, "Who gave you the right to have my car towed?" And I can say back to him, "Hey, buddy, you should be singing my praises. You should be thanking me, because the halacha permitted me just to crash into your car to move it, if that was since you were blocking me from getting out of my driveway. So I went to the extra effort and waited for the tow company to come because I wanted to do you a favor. So you should be thanking me that that's all you have to pay for. Otherwise, you'd be paying for a new fender right now."
And if, for example, the tow company says for an extra fee, we can break open or unlock the door and take off the parking brake so there's less damage to the car, then I guess that extra fee that you've paid to reduce the damage to the person's car would also be recoverable.
Right. Whatever effort, whatever you expend, you can recover because it's part of the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda.
And you're trying to mitigate the loss to the other party.
Exactly.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Sure. Any other questions? So the reason why I wanted to see the Bjorn first is because he helps really to clarify the parameters of this halacha. There are times when I can be held legally responsible if I damage someone else's property, and my claim that I was doing it to save my own property will not be upholdable simply because I could have saved my property without doing any extra effort. I could have saved my property without damaging his property. But if it requires additional effort, then I will not be held liable in a human court, but because of the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, I will be held responsible b'dinei shamayim in Hashem's eyes. Okay, so this is where I think we'll hold it here for today. Have a wonderful day, everybody.